Sergeant Thomas Hartford stood silently at Gate 12 of Heathrow Airport, his back straight, boots polished to a mirror shine, and crimson tunic pristine despite the drizzle he had passed through just moments earlier. His tall bearskin hat added nearly a foot to his height, drawing curious glances from travelers, some of whom paused to take discreet photos. He didn't mind. He was used to being watched. That morning, he had been on duty at the gates of Buckingham Palace, fulfilling his ceremonial post with the precision and solemnity expected of the Queen's Guard. But his orders had changed swiftly. He was needed in Edinburgh to represent his unit at a royal military funeral, one involving a former commanding officer whose influence had shaped the careers of dozens, including his own. With only a few hours to prepare, the ministry had booked him the earliest flight possible, a first-class seat. Given the urgency and the honor involved, he carried his orders in a slim leather folder, official, signed, stamped. His ID matched the uniform, the name, the mission. Everything was in place. Except now, as he approached the boarding gate, something had shifted. "Excuse me, sir," the airline manager said, stepping forward. She was mid-40s, stern-faced, her blonde hair tied tightly into a knot. Her name badge read, M. Davidson. Thomas turned his head gently. "Yes, ma'am. You said you're flying first class." "I am. It's been arranged by the Ministry of Defense. I have the confirmation here." He opened the folder carefully, presenting his documents. She barely glanced at them. "Are you aware impersonating military personnel is a federal offense?" The question stunned him, not because it was loud or accusatory, but because it was so unexpected. For a moment, he thought he'd misheard. "I beg your pardon." "You heard me," she said, her voice lowering, as if suddenly aware of the people around them. "We've had cases, you know. People dressing up to get attention. Or upgrades. It's not a costume party." Thomas said nothing. Not because he didn't have words, but because words, at that moment, seemed to cheapen the weight of his silence. "I'm not impersonating," he said softly. "This is my uniform. I've served for 19 years. Afghanistan, Iraq, Cyprus. The orders are official. My name is Sergeant Thomas Hartford." Her eyes narrowed. She looked down at his boots, the creases of his trousers, the brass buttons. "Still," she muttered. "We'll need to verify this." "That's absolutely fine," he replied. "Please do." She took the folder and walked to the counter, whispering with another staff member. Thomas stood there, holding his small carry-on. It contained a single neatly folded overcoat, a personal photo tucked between a notebook, and a letter of condolence he was to read at the service. The passengers in line behind him shifted awkwardly, unsure whether to step around him or just wait. Some looked sympathetic. Others kept their eyes on their phones. Minutes passed, 5. Then 10. Miss Davidson returned with a forced smile. "We've spoken to someone from your regiment. They said you are indeed Sergeant Hartford. Apologies for the confusion." But she didn't sound apologetic. "And my seat?" he asked calmly, her lips tightened. "There was an issue. While we were confirming, the seat was reassigned. I'm afraid the cabin is full." He blinked once, slowly, "But I had a confirmed ticket," he said. "And I'm flying on royal duty." "Yes, but you didn't check in early enough. You delayed the check-in." She avoided his gaze. "I'm sorry, Sergeant, but there's nothing I can do now. We can place you in economy." There was a moment of silence so thick it felt like time itself had paused. Thomas didn't shout. He didn't raise a finger or demand anything. He simply inhaled, long and quiet, and nodded. "Then I will take economy," he said. "But I hope, for the sake of the next soldier who walks in uniform through your terminal, that this doesn't happen again." A few travelers nearby applauded faintly, almost unconsciously. A woman clutched her child tighter. A man in a business suit frowned, as if finally realizing something important had just happened. As he boarded, Thomas passed by the first-class section, where a vacant seat by the window stood empty. No one sat there. He took his seat in economy, adjusted his long legs carefully, and leaned his head against the window. Outside, the sky turned a soft gray. Rain tapped gently against the glass, and then, a voice, "Excuse me." A young woman in her 20s, seated beside him, looked unsure. I wanted to say thank you. My brother's in the army. I know what you guys go through. And I'm sorry for what just happened." He smiled. "Thank you. That means more than you know." She offered him a cup of water. "You going somewhere important?" "Yes. A funeral. Someone I admired greatly." "I'm sorry." "So am I." The plane taxied and rose into the clouds. As the city shrank below, Thomas closed his eyes and thought of Edinburgh. He thought of the stone halls, the hush of bagpipes, the way the guard would stand at attention beside the coffin. And how, no matter where he sat on this plane, he would stand for that man with all the dignity he could summon, because service wasn't about comfort. It wasn't about seats or upgrades, it was about showing up, and despite everything, the flight hadn't boarded yet. After Sergeant Thomas Hartford took his seat in economy, he placed the folder back into his bag and rested his hands on his lap. But just as the hum of the engines began to rise and flight attendants walked down the aisle with calm, practiced steps, a voice from the front of the cabin broke through the quiet. "Sergeant Hartford." Came a clipped tone. He looked up to see Miss Davidson again. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a man in a dark Navy airport security uniform. Not a guard, not a bouncer, but someone with presence. His shoulders were broad, his posture straight. His name badge read Officer J. Daniels. "We need you to step off the plane for a moment," Davidson said. "Just a brief clarification." Thomas could feel the eyes again, passengers peering over seatbacks, phones sliding out from pockets. He exhaled silently and stood. The young woman beside him opened her mouth as if to speak, but he offered her a gentle shake of the head. He didn't want to draw her into it. As he walked back down the narrow aisle, Daniel stepped slightly to the side to let him pass, then followed. Davidson led them past the boarding gate, to a quieter side corridor near the customer service desk. A second staff member stood nearby, older, slightly balding, name badge, Coleman, manager. He was already scowling. "All right," Coleman began, arms crossed. "Let's be honest here, sir. This uniform, it's unusual. It's the official ceremonial uniform of Her Majesty's Coldstream Guards," Thomas replied. "Worn with full permissions. I am traveling on royal duty." Daniels glanced at the manager, then looked at Thomas again. "May I see your ID, Sergeant?" "Of course." Thomas handed him both his military ID and the mod travel orders. Daniels examined them carefully, nodding. "These look legitimate," he said. "They are," Thomas replied softly. Coleman cut in. "Still. This outfit. It's attracting too much attention. People are taking photos. It's not standard passenger behavior." "With respect," Thomas said, turning to Coleman, "it's not standard duty either. B. But we wear it because it represents something greater than ourselves. And today, I am traveling not for leisure, but to bury a man who wore this uniform long before me." Daniels shifted, clearly moved. He looked over at Coleman. "Have you contacted the mod liaison or the palace office? These are not the kind of documents you fabricate. And frankly, I've seen impersonators before. This isn't one of them." Coleman shook his head stubbornly. "Look, I'm not saying he's dangerous. But this kind of attire, it's disruptive. Especially if passengers feel confused or intimidated. We have policies. And I respect policies," Thomas said. "But I boarded with full clearance. I went through security. I presented my credentials. What more must I do?" The hallway fell quiet. Daniels took a slow breath. Sergeant Hartford, I believe you. Everything checks out. I can escort you back to your seat if you're willing. Thomas nodded. Thank you. But as he turned, Coleman muttered under his breath, still doesn't look right. Daniels heard it. With all due respect, Manager Coleman, what doesn't look right is dragging a decorated soldier off a plane for doing nothing wrong. The passengers noticed. They always do. You don't undo that. For a moment, Coleman seemed ready to argue. But instead, he exhaled sharply and waved a hand. Do what you like. Back on the plane, Thomas returned to his seat. The young woman beside him gave a half smile. Everything okay? Yes, he said gently. It will be. Officer Daniels came with him to the seat and gave a quick nod. If anyone causes trouble, let the crew know. And thank you for your service, Sergeant. Thomas looked him in the eye. That means a great deal. The flight finally took off, but in the hours that followed, Thomas didn't sleep. He stared out the window, watching the clouds drift by like thoughts too heavy to hold. Not because he was angry, but because this wasn't the first time he'd been doubted. And it probably wouldn't be the last, not because of his service, but because of how people saw his service. To some, he was just a man in a costume, but to others, to those who understood, he carried the weight of tradition, of sacrifice, of quiet honor. He thought of his mother, who had raised him on her own in a small house in Manchester. She had once ironed the edges of his first cadet uniform, hands trembling with pride. He thought of Corporal Lane, the man they were burying, who had once pulled him out of a trench in Helmand Province, bleeding and half-conscious, and he thought of the years, the freezing nights, the silent vigils, the comrades who never came home. The uniform wasn't just thread and wool. It was memory. And meaning. The plane touched down in Edinburgh. As passengers stood to retrieve their bags, several nodded in his direction. A few whispered thank yous. One man clapped him on the shoulder and said simply, respect. And then, without fanfare, Thomas stepped off the plane. A staff member from the Edinburgh Military Liaison Office greeted him at the terminal, holding a discreet placard. Sergeant Hartford. Yes. We've got your transport. Straight to the cathedral. They're holding the final rehearsal now. Thomas nodded. By the way, the liaison added as they walked, we got word from Heathrow. Apparently there was a misunderstanding. Thomas smiled faintly. Let's just say I got a bit more attention than usual. Well, for what it's worth, you're exactly what that uniform's meant to stand for. Thomas didn't answer. He didn't need to, because sometimes, the silence says everything. Thomas Hartford sat quietly as Officer Daniels departed, grateful for the man's respect, though the sting of what had just happened hadn't faded. The uniform clung to him not just physically, with its high collar and thick wool, but emotionally, as if each thread carried the weight of history, and now, fresh humiliation. He had returned to his seat in economy, head held high, but there was something unmistakably heavy in the air. 15 minutes later, the gate agent reappeared at his row. This time, it was not Miss Davidson but Manager Coleman himself, flanked by a junior staff member holding a tablet. Sergeant Hartford, Coleman said, his tone clipped, we've reviewed your case again. Thomas looked up, eyes steady. There's still no proof of purchase on file from our end, Coleman continued. We can't confirm the payment for the first-class seat. Thomas blinked slowly. The Ministry of Defense arranged the ticket. I was informed everything was prepaid and processed. I'm here under orders. We don't have that record, Coleman insisted. And unless you can show a physical receipt with transaction ID or proof of credit card authorization, we can't place you in that cabin. Thomas reached into his folder and pulled out the printed itinerary, complete with a mod travel authorization letter. This is all I was issued. Coleman didn't even take it. It doesn't confirm payment. But it confirms government booking. Surely your system, we've seen fakes before, sir, Coleman interrupted. Very convincing ones. Uniforms. Papers. Even real-looking ID cards. Until this is clarified with our accounts department, you'll remain in economy. Now, voices began to stir around them. Excuse me, said an older man sitting 2 rows ahead. He stood, leaning heavily on a cane. His jacket bore a small poppy pin on the lapel. I served in the Falklands. I know that uniform. Sir, Coleman said, trying to wave him off. No, the man said sharply. That's not how you treat a soldier. Especially one on duty. Another voice joined. He had his paperwork. You've already confirmed his identity, haven't you? A woman asked from across the aisle. The cabin murmured, a few people shaking their heads, some pulling out phones again, but Thomas raised his hand. Please, he said quietly. I don't want a scene. He turned to Coleman. You've made your decision. I will remain in my seat. But it's wrong. The veteran snapped. Young man, you shouldn't take this lying down. Thomas looked at him, grateful, but tired. I appreciate your words, sir, he said. But some fights aren't won by standing up. Some are won by showing up and staying calm. The veteran exhaled hard and nodded, his hand tightening on the cane. You're better than me, lad. Coleman turned and left without another word, but not before Thomas caught the flicker of discomfort in the junior staffer's eyes, as if even she knew this had crossed a line. The rest of the flight was quiet. Too quiet. No one made eye contact with Coleman when he passed down the aisle during final checks. The uniformed soldier, once a curiosity, now sat wrapped in quiet solidarity, the passengers near him offering water, a blanket, anything to honor a dignity that didn't come from a seat or title, but from how a man holds himself when he's been wronged. As the plane lifted into the night sky, Thomas closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to breathe. He imagined the chapel in Edinburgh where the service would be held. The polished floors. The slow march. The hush of reverence as the honor guard would approach the casket. He knew his role. He had done it before, and yet, this time. It would be harder, because no one had told him how heavy grief could feel when carried alone. Or how pride, once questioned, didn't just ache, it lingered. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small photograph. Faded at the edges. It showed a younger Thomas, kneeling in dusty fatigues, an arm slung around Corporal Lane. Both of them smiling like the world was still whole. He held the photo gently in one gloved hand, his other palm resting on the folder, as if to remind himself, you belong. You've earned your place. As the plane pierced through the clouds, Thomas whispered a single line under his breath, for you, Lane. I'll stand. Even if no one else sees it. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane leveled out at cruising altitude. Sergeant Thomas Hartford sat still, his hat stowed carefully beneath the seat in front of him, and his mind somewhere far from the polished aluminum tubes sailing through the sky. He was lost in thought when the man beside him shifted slightly in his seat. Bit of a rough welcome, the man said, his voice gravelly but calm. Thomas turned. The man was in his 70s, silver hair cropped close, shoulders still broad despite age. His hands bore old scars, not angry or fresh, but softened by time. The kind that told stories, even if the man didn't. I've seen your kind before, the man added, offering a faint smile. Coldstream Guard, I. Yes, sir, Thomas replied. Sergeant Thomas Hartford. Walter Simmons, the man said, extending a hand. Retired Royal Marine, 42 Commando. Long time ago. They shook hands, a quiet moment of mutual respect passing between them. I saw what happened, Walter continued. Manager treated you like a schoolboy caught sneaking into a theater. Wasn't right. Thomas gave a half smile. I've had worse. Doesn't mean you should have to take it, Walter said. You were humiliated in front of a crowd. In uniform. With documents. And you handled it like a bloody officer. Calm, measured, respectful. Thomas sighed. I didn't want to embarrass the regiment. Or the mission. Walter nodded. I get that. But let me ask you something, Sergeant. What happens when someone else walks in your shoes next week? Another lad in dress uniform, headed to a funeral or a ceremony, and he gets treated the same because no one pushed back today. Thomas didn't answer right away. Walter leaned back slightly, watching the clouds drift past the window. Sometimes, standing up for yourself isn't just about you. It's about the next bloke too. Thomas looked down at his hands. I suppose I just kept thinking. If I make a fuss, it proves them right. That were difficult. Demanding. Walter chuckled softly. You didn't demand anything. You had a confirmed seat, you were rerouted without cause, accused without evidence, and then denied your dignity while being surrounded by civilians with phones. That's not being difficult. That's called being wronged. Thomas looked at the old Marine. You think I should file a complaint? Walter's eyes sharpened. No. I think you must. Thomas exhaled slowly. The ministry might frown on it. The ministry won't frown if it's handled properly. And even if they do it anyway. Not as a soldier, but as a man. As someone who believes in the values the uniform stands for. Respect. Truth. Honor. For a moment, the plane felt quieter. Thomas nodded. You're right. Walter gave him a small grin. Of course I am. I've had 50 years to get good at being right. They both laughed, softly, and for the first time since boarding, the air around Thomas felt a little lighter. Walter continued, Tell you what. I've got a few contacts still hanging about the Royal British Legion. If you'd like, I can help you frame the letter. Keep it factual, respectful. But firm. Truth deserves a voice. Thank you, Mr. Simmons. That means more than I can say. You can call me Walter. And don't thank me. I'm just an old soldier watching the next generation carry the torch. You carried it well today, even if no one saluted. They spent the remainder of the flight speaking sparingly, a few quiet exchanges about regiments, old missions, soldiers long gone. Two men from different wars, bound by the same code. When the plane began its descent, Walter looked at Thomas one last time. You make sure they hear your voice, son. You wore that uniform with honor. Now wear your words with the same. Thomas extended his hand again. I will. And thank you. Walter smiled, eyes glinting with something deeper than pride, memory, perhaps. Semper Fidelis, lad. As they touched down in Edinburgh and the plane rolled to a stop, Thomas felt steadier than before. The fatigue of the day, the insult at the gate, the stares and suspicion, they still lingered, but they no longer felt so heavy. Because now, he knew it wasn't about him alone, it was about everyone who had ever been dismissed while standing tall. About everyone who had been judged before they could speak. And about the silent promise he had made long ago when he first put on the uniform, to carry its weight with grace, even when it bent his back, as he exited the aircraft. The cool Scottish wind met him with a brisk slap. It felt honest. Bracing. Real, and somewhere deep inside, Thomas Hartford, Sergeant, Queen's Guard, son of a nurse from Manchester, brother to a fallen comrade, stood taller. He would file the complaint. Not out of revenge, but out of responsibility, and then, he would walk into the cathedral and stand guard beside the casket of a man who had once saved his life, because even when the world tried to strip you down, you stood. That was the code. The plane had begun its slow descent, Edinburgh's rugged coast peeking through breaks in the clouds below, when the commotion began 2 rows behind Sergeant Thomas Hartford, a muffled gasp. A loud thump, then a cry, he's not breathing. Thomas turned instantly. The passenger, a man in his 60s, pale and motionless, had collapsed across the aisle. A woman next to him was shaking his shoulder in panic, her voice trembling. David? David. The flight attendant, already mid-cabin, rushed to the scene, pressing her intercom. We need medical assistance. Is there a doctor on board? Silence. Passengers turned in their seats. Some froze, unsure what to do. Others whispered nervously, but Thomas had already unbuckled his belt and stood. I'm trained, he said, moving toward the man without waiting for permission. Combat medic training. Move the seat back. Give me space. Walter Simmons watched as Thomas dropped to his knees beside the man. No theatrics, no panic. Just focus. He tilted the man's head, checked for breathing, for a pulse. Nothing, he's in cardiac arrest, Thomas said. Get me the AED. A flight attendant handed him the device, hands shaking. He opened it, powered it on, and followed the prompts like second nature. Stay back, he warned, loud but calm. Everyone clear. The shock came with a jolt. The man's chest jumped. Thomas didn't hesitate, immediately launching into chest compressions. Hard. Measured. Consistent. The kind that could break ribs, but also bring back life. 1. 2. 3. His voice was quiet, counting under his breath, but steady. A rhythm forged not in classrooms, but in sandblasted barracks and blood-soaked triage tents. The AED spoke again, analyzing heart rhythm. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow, eyes never leaving the man's face. Then, a flicker. The man's chest rose. A soft gasp. He was breathing, a weak, rattling breath, but it was there. The cabin erupted into soft murmurs and then applause, hesitant at first, then growing as realization dawned. He had saved a life. The man blinked, dazed. His wife sobbed quietly, clutching her husband's hand. Then looked up at Thomas, lips trembling. Thank you. Thank you. Thomas nodded once, his voice low. You'll be all right. Just stay still. Paramedics will meet us when we land. The flight crew guided Thomas back to his seat gently. Someone handed him a bottle of water. Another a pack of tissues. He didn't speak much. Just sat, catching his breath. Walter leaned over. You all right? Thomas gave a half smile. I've been better. Walter chuckled. I've seen medics in combat zones that didn't move like that. You didn't even blink. Thomas took a sip of water. Training takes over. No, Walter said, voice thick with admiration. Character takes over. Training just rides along. And then, it happened. Manager Coleman, who had remained cold and aloof until now, appeared at the edge of the economy section, eyes wide. For the first time, his face showed something different, disbelief. And shame. He didn't speak, he didn't need to, everyone saw it, the soldier he'd humiliated, the man he'd questioned, the man he'd accused of wearing a costume, had just brought someone back from the brink of death, not with rank, not with title, but with skill, precision, and heart. The rest of the flight passed in quiet awe. When the wheels touched down and the aircraft rolled to the gate, emergency personnel came aboard swiftly. They thanked Thomas with reverence, offering to escort him out first. He declined. I'll wait, he said. He goes first. As the stretcher was wheeled out, the man, still pale, but alert, locked eyes with Thomas and nodded, mouthing one word, grateful. Passengers lined the aisle, parting to make space for him, many reaching out, a handshake, a nod, a whispered thank you. And as Thomas finally stepped onto Scottish soil, the wind struck his face again, not just cold now, but fresh, alive. The Edinburgh wind carried with it a damp chill as Sergeant Thomas Hartford stepped through the arrival gate and into the reception area. The air smelled of rain and old stone, the kind of scent that seemed carved into the very character of Scotland. It had only been a short flight, but the day had felt endless. Waiting for him, standing near a sleek black government vehicle, was Commander Blackwood, tall, built like a column of iron, and known for his unflinching composure. Blackwood had served as Thomas's superior for nearly a decade. A man of few words, but every one of them counted. Sergeant, he said, offering a nod. Sir, Thomas replied, standing at attention despite the travel. Blackwood's eyes briefly scanned him, the uniform, still immaculate, the eyes, slightly tired, the posture, unshaken. We received word you'd arrived. The procession briefing starts in 1 hour. But I was told you requested a moment. Yes, sir. I felt it important to report something. Not regarding the funeral. Blackwood motioned toward a quiet corner of the hall, away from the stream of passengers and the military liaison team. Thomas took a breath. Then, in a steady, measured voice, he told him everything, the initial suspicion at the gate, the denial of his seat, the questioning of his uniform, his identity, his orders, the forced reassignment to economy, and finally, the life he had saved mid-flight. He didn't embellish. He didn't inject emotion or blame. Just facts, delivered with the same clarity and discipline that had guided him through every deployment and every parade ground inspection. Blackwood listened without interruption, arms folded behind his back, gaze focused but unreadable. When Thomas finished, he stood still, hands at his side. I don't bring this up, sir, to seek reparation, he added. But I believe the treatment reflects a deeper issue. One that could affect others. And I feel an obligation to document it. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant rolling of suitcase wheels on polished tile. Then Blackwood spoke, voice low and resolute. You were profiled. Doubted. Disrespected, while on duty. In uniform. With valid orders. It's unacceptable. Yes, sir. And you remained calm. You de-escalated. You protected the dignity of this regiment, and the life of a civilian. Thomas said nothing, but his throat tightened just slightly at the commander's words. Blackwood turned his gaze toward the window, where gray clouds hung heavy over the city. You'll write a formal account of the incident. Include dates, names, dialogue. I'll endorse it myself. And we'll send it through mod channels, with witness statements, if needed. British Airways will answer for this. Thomas nodded, his jaw set, and Sergeant, Blackwood continued, turning back to him, make no mistake, your response in that cabin. That wasn't duty. That was honor. We train for many things, but the choice to rise above injustice, that comes from within. Thank you, sir. Blackwood leaned forward, voice just above a whisper. I want you sharp for this funeral. Corporal Lane deserves nothing less. But know this, what happened at Terminal 5 will not disappear in silence. With that, he stepped back and offered a final nod. Dismissed. Thomas saluted crisply and turned. Walking toward the waiting vehicle, inside, as the car made its way through the winding streets of Edinburgh, he watched the old stone buildings blur past, cathedrals, tenements, bridges, and parks, and somewhere in that blur, he saw himself. A boy who had once watched the Queen's Guard in awe, thinking they were statues in scarlet, distant, untouchable. And now, a man who had become one of them, not for the glory, but for what the uniform meant, service, restraint, sacrifice. He had been doubted, he had been dismissed, but when it mattered most, he had acted. Quietly. Decisively. Without waiting for permission, and that, far more than rank or ribbon, was what made him a soldier. The cathedral loomed into view, the bagpipes were already playing. He adjusted his cuffs, fixed the line of his collar, and whispered under his breath, for Lane. And for those watching. Then, without fanfare, he stepped out, not just to guard the ceremony, but to stand once more for something far greater than himself, because you do not need a title to prove your worth, you just need the courage to keep standing, even when no one sees, and especially when they do. By late afternoon, the funeral had ended. Sergeant Thomas Hartford stood beneath the great arch of the Edinburgh Cathedral, the marble steps damp from a light rain, his face still solemn beneath the polished brim of his bearskin cap. Inside, Corporal Lane had been honored in full, a 21-gun salute, the laying of the regimental flag, the final roll call. Thomas had stood at attention beside the casket throughout, a pillar of stillness, as memories washed over him in quiet waves. And now, the silence afterward felt heavier than the service itself, but before he could retreat into thought, his military-issued phone buzzed gently in his coat pocket. It was a message from Commander Blackwood, spoken to BA leadership. Incident formally reported. Terminal 5 operations suspended pending internal investigation. Details classified. Will brief you soon. You did the regiment proud. Thomas reread the message twice, his breath caught, not in triumph, but in vindication. He looked up at the gray sky, letting the mist settle on his face, letting the wind remind him he was alive, and seen. Later that evening, in the officers' mess of the Edinburgh garrison, Commander Blackwood sat across from a few senior personnel, his expression unreadable as always. But there was a fire in his eyes not even a stiff collar could contain. I don't care if it was a gate agent or a general, he said, his voice quiet but seething. A man in uniform, on official duty, was publicly humiliated, accused of impersonation, and stripped of a seat arranged by the Crown. He picked up a printed report from MOD liaison files, complete with statements from passengers, medical crew, and even a flight attendant who'd anonymously confirmed that Hartford's orders were clear and valid from the moment he arrived. He set the report down. British Airways will respond with more than apologies. I've spoken with the Director of Government Affairs. Terminal 5 operations have been halted for 24 hours, internal disciplinary actions pending. If they cannot guarantee respect, they will not operate under this flag. Around him, the room was silent, because everyone knew, this wasn't about one flight, it was about the principle. A week later, the story made the rounds in military and civilian circles alike. Not a media circus, not a public scandal. Just a quiet headline tucked in the Times: Serviceman denied seat, saves life mid-flight, BA launches full investigation. No names. No quotes. Just the facts, but within the ranks, from the lowest private to the highest commander, the message was clear: we protect our own. And Thomas, he didn't ask for recognition. He didn't speak at press conferences. He returned to duty the following morning with the same discipline he always carried. But something had changed. A young private saluted him just a little more crisply on parade. A junior officer quietly asked, "You were on that flight, weren't you, Sergeant?" And even Walter Simmons, the retired Marine, sent him a handwritten note 2 weeks later: "You stood taller than your uniform that day." That's saying something. Thomas folded the note and tucked it inside the same folder that once held his travel orders, now a memento of a journey that proved, beyond doubt, that honor isn't something sewn onto your shoulder, it's something you carry in silence, and show when it matters most, because in a world too quick to judge by appearance, sometimes it takes one quiet man in a red coat and black boots, to remind everyone what dignity truly looks like. 2 weeks after Sergeant Thomas Hartford returned to his regular post at Wellington Barracks, the skies over London were unusually clear. The routine of daily inspection, parade formations, and sentry rotations had resumed, but for Thomas, something beneath the surface felt different. Not louder. Not more important. Just affirmed. As though the uniform now settled on him with the weight not just of history, but of something freshly earned. Then, on a brisk Thursday morning, news broke, quietly at first, not on television. Not in tabloids, but in a confidential bulletin issued to senior military command and government departments. The Civil Aviation Authority, CAA, had launched a full-scale audit. The subject: allegations of systemic mistreatment and discrimination against uniformed service members by commercial airline staff. At the center of it all, British Airways, Terminal 5, London Heathrow. Buried within the briefing were chilling details. Over the past 3 years, at least 9 separate incidents had been reported, quietly, without media attention. Soldiers in uniform delayed. Veterans questioned. Medics denied boarding over disruptive attire. All dismissed as administrative errors. But Sergeant Hartford's case had changed the tide. His composure, his CPR rescue, and the detailed internal report filed by Commander Blackwood, complete with testimonies from fellow passengers, had tipped the scales. What had once been isolated anecdotes had now formed a pattern. And the names involved? Uncannily familiar, the same management team, the same gate officers, the same subtle humiliation disguised as policy enforcement. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a culture, and now, it was unraveling. Within 48 hours, 3 staff members were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. A whistleblower, emboldened by Hartford's report, came forward with internal emails revealing unofficial guidelines suggesting that military uniforms might cause discomfort to premium passengers. The backlash was immediate. Parliament requested a formal hearing. The Ministry of Defense issued a statement reaffirming that servicemen and women, in uniform or not, carry the nation's trust, and should never be made to feel unwelcome in their own homeland. British Airways scrambled to respond. A new military respect protocol was hastily drafted, training workshops announced, and a full-page apology published in the Telegraph. But among the ranks, the soldiers didn't speak of policies or public relations. They spoke of Hartford, the man who stood silent when accused, but stood firm when it mattered. In barracks, his name was whispered with respect, not for what he had endured, but for the way he had endured it. With grace. With grit. With the unshakable presence of someone who didn't need validation to know his worth, and though Thomas said little, never bragged, never corrected those who misquoted the story, there was one moment that marked a quiet closure. Late one evening, he received a letter, stamped with the seal of the Civil Aviation Authority. Inside, a simple sentence: "Your testimony helped reveal what others feared to say. On behalf of those silenced before, we thank you." He folded the letter, placed it beside Walter Simmons' note, and returned to polishing his boots for parade, because dignity doesn't come with medals, it comes with moments, when the world tries to reduce you to a costume, and you remind them you are far more, a soldier, a guardian, and a man who stood still, until the system itself was finally moved. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like and share it. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring videos. Thanks again and see you in the next one.